Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into something pretty close to home for a lot of Catholics today, I think. The Mass. You know, how it's changed since Vatican II and how those changes have, well, impacted Catholic life.
Mhm.
We're going to try to look at it all through the lens of a traditional Catholic living 60 years after the Council.
Yeah, definitely a perspective worth exploring. It's not just, rituals and rubrics. We're talking about the very heart of Catholic worship and how that shapes faith and how people live it out.
Definitely. And our guide for this deep dive is Michael Davies. His book, Liturgical Shipwreck, 25 Years of the New Mass. I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with Davies. Very strong traditionalist Catholic, very vocal critic of the changes after Vatican II.
Right. He sees the changes as this huge departure from centuries of tradition, almost like as the title suggests, a ship veering way off course.
Okay, so let's set the scene, right?
Right.
Imagine you're a Catholic back in the 1950s. The traditional Latin Mass, the TLM, that's all you know. That's what you love. That's the Mass of your parents, your grandparents, generations steeped in its, beauty and mystery.
And it's not just about nostalgia, right? We're talking about some serious thinkers here. Father Faber called it the most beautiful thing this side of heaven. Cardinal Newman, huge figure, talked about attending Mass forever and not be tired. That says a lot about the depth of reverence and spiritual nourishment they found in that TLM experience.
Okay, so then comes Vatican II, right? This momentous council, 1960s, huge goal of revitalizing the church, making it more accessible to the modern world, and liturgical reform is right at the heart of it.
Yeah, they wanted greater lay participation, clearer language, that connection to daily life. They wanted people to really feel connected to the liturgy.
Sounds good on paper, right? Fresh air. But here's where Davies kind of throws a wrench in things. He argues that it wasn't a simple reform, it was a liturgical revolution, and that it went way beyond what the council actually intended.
He's not just basing this on personal opinion, though. He really delves into the history of liturgical development. He points out that they evolve organically, right? Just like languages, over centuries, shaped by prayer, tradition, and a deepening understanding of faith. You don't just invent them.
Right, and he quotes the historian Owen Chadwick, who said, "Liturgies are not made, they grow in the devotion of centuries." And Davies argues that the new Mass, the Novus Ordo Missae, just completely broke with that, like chopping down an old-growth tree and trying to graft a new branch onto it.
Powerful analogy. And it leads him to a pretty bold comparison. He sees parallels between what happened after Vatican II and the Protestant Reformation.
Now, he's not saying the Catholic Church became Protestant, but he's pointing out that reformers like Martin Luther also broke from centuries of liturgical tradition, right, composing these new rites.
He quotes Adrian Fortescue, the liturgical scholar. Fortescue said that Protestants just broke away utterly from all historic liturgical evolution by making these new rites. And Davies sees that as a dangerous thing, no matter who does it.
So Davies is really painting a picture of this rupture, this break from the flow. But he doesn't stop there. He digs into the concilium, the commission that put together the new Mass, and he highlights the involvement of, get this, Protestant theologians in the process.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. Davies argues this wasn't just, ecumenical dialogue. He thinks it actually impacted the shape of the new Mass, pushed it closer to Protestant forms of worship.
Yeah, he even quotes, this is a big one, Jean Guiton, a close friend of Pope Paul VI. Apparently, Guiton said the Pope actually wanted to align the Mass with Calvinist worship.
Now, we could debate the accuracy of that, but it definitely fuels Davies' argument,
Definitely raises some eyebrows. Like, how much influence did they really have? Was there a deliberate attempt to, kind of Protestantize the Mass? These are the kind of questions traditional Catholics are wrestling with 60 years later.
Absolutely. And these concerns weren't just, whispers in the back pews. They were brought up very publicly and very authoritatively by Cardinal Ottaviani, prefect for the doctrine of the faith at the time.
Big deal.
Huge deal. He co-authored this incredibly critical study of the new Mass, saying it was a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass.
Wow. I mean, coming from someone in that position, it had to lend some weight to what a lot of traditional Catholics were feeling.
Right.
If Ottaviani is troubled, shouldn't we at least take that seriously?
Absolutely. And Davies does. He uses that critique as more evidence for his whole shipwreck idea. And then, if Ottaviani wasn't enough, he brings in another big name. Msgr. Klaus Gamber, renowned liturgist, expert on the history of the Roman Rite.
And Gamber, well, he doesn't hold back. He calls the reform a debacle, a liturgical destruction of startling proportions. Strong words.
Strong words. He goes so far as to say the changes were more radical than Luther's. He even says the new Mass gives people stones instead of bread.
What's interesting is Gamber was actually praised by Cardinal Ratzinger, who of course became Pope Benedict. So you have this figure admired by both sides, expressing really deep concerns about the direction things went.
So Davies is setting the stage, highlighting the break from tradition. Then he brings in Ottaviani, he brings in Gamber to back him up. Brick by brick, he's making the case that the new Mass is a huge departure from the TLM. But he doesn't just stay with these big ideas. He actually gets down into the specifics, the actual changes, and how they impact the experience of Mass. I think that's where we need to go next.
Let's get into the nuts and bolts, see how they connect to this bigger story Davies is telling. So, we've talked about how Davies sees this big break with tradition, but for a lot of traditional Catholics, it's not just some idea. They feel it every time they go to Mass. Exactly. It's like you walk into your living room and all the furniture's been moved around. Paintings are different. I mean, it's the same room, but it just feels different. The whole atmosphere is off.
Right. And Davies gets very specific. He points to certain changes that really, in his view, change the character of the Mass, like this shift from Latin to the vernacular, communion in the hand, female altar servers. And, a lot of the rituals just got simplified.
And for him, this isn't just like, oh, they're changing the window dressing. He's saying it changes how the Mass is understood, how it's lived. It's not just what you see and hear. It's about what it means.
Yeah, and he brings up that idea of lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The law of prayer is the law of belief. He's arguing that if you change how we pray, you risk changing what we believe.
So the new liturgy, it's almost like a blurry lens. It's distorting the image of the faith.
Yeah.
Instead of making it clearer.
Exactly. And this leads him to a really, I think, important point, which is the decline in Mass attendance, religious practice across the board, especially in countries that were, traditionally Catholic strongholds.
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny it, right?
Yeah.
Churches that were packed they're not packed anymore. And Davies links this directly to the changes in the liturgy. He's saying, look, people are leaving. They're not finding what they need in the new Mass.
No, of course it's complicated. We can't just say, oh, it's all because of the liturgy. I mean, society's changing. You've got secularization, all these other things happening. But Davies's point is that the reforms really alienated a lot of people who felt connected to the traditional Latin Mass.
He even contrasts this with Pope John Paul II's take on things in Vicesimus Quintus Annus.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope praises how the new liturgy was received, but then Davies is like, well, look at the numbers. They tell a different story.
And it's not just about empty pews, right? Davies brings up folks who were, originally on board with the liturgical movement, but ended up being really critical. Father Louis Boyer, for example.
Yeah, big name in liturgical studies.
Hugely influential. But then he writes this book, The Decomposition of Catholicism, and it is brutal. He basically says, there is practically no liturgy worthy of the name today in the Catholic Church. I mean, what a change of heart.
Yeah. Like going from cheerleader to total whistleblower.
Right. And I think that statement really captures the feeling of loss and bewilderment for a lot of traditional Catholics. It's not just about aesthetics, picking and choosing what you like. They feel like something sacred has been lost.
And Davies really brings that to the forefront. He wants us to see what it's like to be on that side, to feel that loss, to experience Mass, not as this, source of life, but as this reminder of what's gone. But, amidst all this critique, he does offer a little glimmer of hope, the resurgence of interest in the TLM. And get this, especially among younger generations.
It's wild, right? You'd think 60 years after Vatican II, the TLM would be, gone. A footnote, but it's making a comeback.
It's like a seed that was buried, but, it never really died. And now it's, sprouting up again. And in the generation that grew up with the new Mass. That's what's so interesting.
Right. It's not just, older folks clinging to the past. What do you think it is about the TLM that's attracting these, younger people?
So we've gone through Davies's critique, the whole liturgical shipwreck thing. We've seen how someone so attached to the TLM views all these changes. But where do we go from here, right? Is it all just sadness and hand-wringing, or is there a path forward for the Church?
Well, Davies actually, even though he's very critical, does offer some hope. He points to this revival of the TLM, right? Especially among younger Catholics. He sees that as a sign that it's not just some relic of the past.
It still has something to say.
Exactly. It still speaks to people, even today.
It's amazing, though, right? I mean, you would think 60 years after Vatican II, it would just kind of be gone.
You'd think so.
But it's not. And the fact that it's young people, that's what's so fascinating to me.
It is. Because it's not just about nostalgia. It's not just about rejecting, the modern world. A lot of these young people, they're very engaged in contemporary culture. They're on social media, they're tech savvy, they're dealing with all the same stuff as their peers.
So what is it then? What's drawing them to this, centuries-old way of celebrating Mass?
That's the million-dollar question. I think for a lot of them, it's a sense of transcendence, of mystery, of the sacred, things they might not be finding in other parts of their lives.
Yeah.
The TLM with the silence, the symbolism, the Gregorian chant. It's almost like this countercultural experience.
Like a refuge from all the noise and busyness.
Exactly. And in a world that's becoming increasingly secular, maybe that sense of the sacred is even more attractive.
Yeah, maybe. And it's important to say, it's not like these young people are all, anti-new Mass or anything. A lot of them appreciate both. They see them as two ways of expressing the same faith.
Right. It's not an either.
It's both hands.
Exactly. And that's where I think the church has this incredible opportunity to really help people understand and appreciate, the richness of the liturgical tradition.
So instead of this TLM versus new Mass kind of thing, it's like they're both part of the same river.
Beautiful way to put it. And that's how we move forward, I think. We heal these divisions by actually talking to each other, listening to each other, especially those who have felt hurt, alienated by all the changes.
Acknowledging that the transition wasn't perfect.
All right.
That things were lost. And those losses still matter.
And remembering that the TLM isn't just like a museum piece, it's a living thing. And it can still nourish people's faith today, just like it has for, hundreds of years.
So, okay, how do we actually do that? Bridge the divide. What does that look like?
Well, first off, people need access to the TLM. And not just in like a few random places. It needs to be available so that people who want it can experience it.
Makes sense.
And I think we need more education about the history, the theology, so people really get what the different forms of the Roman Rite are all about and how they all contribute to the richness of our tradition.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tension comes from just not understanding.
Absolutely. Knowledge is key. And priests need to be trained in celebrating both forms so they can serve their communities well, meet people's needs.
It's about options, right? Meeting people where they are, giving them what they need to grow.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, the liturgy, it's all about leading us to Christ.
Right.
It's about that encounter in the Word, in the sacraments, in the community.
And that's what matters. Whether it's TLM, new Mass, or some mix of both, the goal is Christ.
Absolutely. So maybe instead of focusing on what divides us, we focus on that, our shared faith, our desire to worship Him.
Yeah. Davies' book, it might seem like it's all about division, but maybe it's actually a call for something more.
A call for renewal, for rediscovering the beauty of the liturgy.
And letting it bring us closer to the heart of our faith.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with those thoughts to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.